Ukraine says the roadmap to security is ready, but the decision now rests in Washington. After high-level talks in Paris, Kyiv says a key security guarantees document is essentially finalized and awaiting approval by U.S. President Donald Trump. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says the deal aligns Europe and the United States on Ukraine's future, from security guarantees to reconstruction and economic recovery. The talks also tackled the hardest question of all: how this war could actually end. Ukraine has put its proposals on the table. Washington is now expected to speak directly with Moscow, but Zelenskyy warns that Russia's latest strikes are sending a different message, that the Kremlin is not preparing for any type of peace agreement except Ukraine's surrender. If peacekeepers come to Ukraine, they must be ready to fight, or Russia will break the ceasefire. That's the blunt warning from Ben Hodges, the former commander of U.S. Army Europe, speaking to The Guardian. Hodges say any peacekeeping force deployed after ceasefire would need thousands of combat-ready troops, clear rules of engagement, and the authority to act immediately, not symbolic presence and not political hesitation. He warns that believing Russia would respect a ceasefire on its own is unrealistic. Between 2014 and 2022, Moscow repeatedly violated every truce it signed. According to Hodges, Russia would test any peacekeeping force from day one with drones, provocations, and pressure. That's why commanders on the ground must be able to respond instantly. They can be calling Paris and London to ask what to do about a Russian drone, he said. Hodges added that Russian forces need to look at the peacekeepers and understand one thing clearly: these are real troops ready to act, not soldiers sitting in barracks far from the front line. This week in Paris, partners agreed in principle to deploy multinational forces to Ukraine after the war. Current estimates range from 15,000 to 20,000 peacekeepers, while Ukraine's own armed forces could remain at around 800,000 troops. Hodges stresses that Ukraine's army would remain the first line of defense, but without serious, credible international forces behind it, any ceasefire would be fragile. Even before any ceasefire or peace talks, Moscow is already issuing warnings. The Kremlin says that any Western troops deployed in Ukraine would be treated as legitimate military targets. No ambiguity, no restraint. The threat came immediately after the Paris Declaration by the so-called Coalition of the Willing on January 6. Russia's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova dismissed the document as far from peace and accused the West of preparing escalation instead of security guarantees. According to Moscow, any Western military presence or infrastructure in Ukraine would be seen as an intervention and therefore a lawful target. In other words, Russia is setting the rules in advance. Support Ukraine seriously and you become the enemy. This tone is quite familiar. The U.S. seizes a shadow fleet tanker used by Russia to bypass sanctions and sell oil. The United States has seized the oil tanker Marinera, formerly Bella 1, a vessel from Russia's shadow fleet used to bypass sanctions and quietly sell oil on the global market. The tanker spent weeks trying to evade U.S. forces, changing its course, name, flag. At one point, a Russian flag was literally painted onto the hull, a common trick used by shadow fleet ships to complicate enforcement. The seizure was carried out under a U.S. federal court warrant. American officials say the vessel was transporting oil for networks linked to Russia, Iran, and Venezuela outside the sanctions regime. Moscow reacted angrily, calling the operation blatant piracy and accusing Washington of violating the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But U.S. officials are blunt. This was not a Russian tanker, but a shadow fleet vessels operating in legal gray zone with opaque ownership, fake registrations, and constant reflagging. In practical terms, this was a direct hit on Russia's oil logistics, one of the key tools the Kremlin uses to keep funding the war despite sanctions.
The actions of the American side violate the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and no state can use force against vessels duly registered in the jurisdictions of other states.
Donald Trump talks about stability with Russia, but his actions tell a different story. According to the New York Times, Trump is playing a double game with the Kremlin. The clearest example is the U.S. military seizure of an oil tanker flying a Russian flag in the North Atlantic, one of the most provocative moves against Moscow during Trump's second term. Washington says the ship was stopped as part of the Venezuelan oil blockade and called it stateless. Moscow sees it very differently. Russian politicians are calling it 21st century piracy. At the same time, Trump has made no concessions on Ukraine. The U.S. continues to share intelligence with with Kyiv, while Europe is increasing defense spending, a clear warning sign for the Kremlin. The toughest U.S. pressure is now in Venezuela, where Washington is openly targeting Russian influence and the so-called shadow fleet used to bypass sanctions. The Kremlin's response has been unusually restrained. Analysts say Moscow is holding back, hoping not to derail potential talks with Trump on Ukraine, but the episode exposes a deeper problem: Russia's ability to use force as leverage is shrinking. A Kremlin envoy was spotted in Paris at the same time Ukraine's security was being discussed. French media report that Kirill Dmitriev, a man linked to the Kremlin and involved in talks with Washington about Russia's war against Ukraine, was spotted in Paris on January 7. French officials deny that he met the French leadership, but according to the report, Dmitriev was received at the U.S. Embassy in Paris. His visit came at a very sensitive moment. Just one day earlier, Paris hosted a high-level meeting of Ukraine's partners focused on security guarantees for Ukraine after a possible ceasefire. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy was there, along with the senior U.S. representatives. On the same day, Dmitriev was seen in Paris. A Ukrainian delegation was still holding talks with the American team and European security advisors. So while Ukraine and its partners were publicly discussing how to deter Russia, a Kremlin-linked figure appeared in the same city for quiet meetings. The Great Britain has confirmed it is sending 13 Raven air defense systems to Ukraine, along with 2 prototypes of a new system called Gravehawk. And this is not just a promise. Raven systems are already in use on the battlefield. Raven is designed to defend frontline areas against drones, aircraft and helicopters. It was developed specifically for Ukraine, adapting a British air-to-air missile for ground launch. The key advantage is speed. The system can be deployed fast under constant attack. At the same time, London is pushing forward with Gravehawk. 2 prototypes are already in Ukraine and 15 more systems are planned. Gravehawk uses Ukraine R-73 missiles and is aimed at protecting critical infrastructure from long-range Russian strikes. The United States has already started selling Venezuelan oil. The first shipment, between 30 and 50 million barrels, are heading to global markets immediately. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, all revenues from these sales will first go into accounts controlled by Washington. The U.S. government will then decide how the money is distributed, saying it will benefit both the American and Venezuelan people. The sales begin now and will continue for an open-ended period to make exports possible. Heavy Venezuelan crude will be blended with lighter U.S. oil. All transportation, the U.S. says, will go through authorized and secure channels. This move follows the U.S. operation in Venezuela and the arrest of Nicolas Maduro. Analysts warn the extra oil on the market could push global prices even lower and deal another blow to Russia and other OPEC Plus producers. Germany's defense minister Boris Pistorius says the Bundeswehr hopes to recruit around 20,000 volunteers this year. He believes the goal can be reached thanks to reforms of military service as Germany reassesses its security needs. Until now, Pistorius avoided giving exact numbers. Last year, just over 12,000 people joined Germany's voluntary military service, far fewer than planned. The conservative bloc says clear targets are needed and warns that if recruitment falls short, Germany may reopen the debate on bringing back compulsory military service by the end of 2026. Germany's parliament approved a law to modernize military service in December, but the discussion about conscription is far from over. Nuclear threats from Britain and NATO are no longer enough to scare the Kremlin, and Western experts are now admitting it. According to The Independent, the problem, they say, isn't weapons. It's outdated thinking. Former UK Air Force Chief Sir Stirrup says Britain relied far too long on nuclear deterrence alone, and that's why Russia was not stopped in Ukraine. Deterrence, he argues, is not a red button. It's a full spectrum, from real troops on the ground to the clear ability and willingness to respond immediately. Western countries may have the capabilities, but they are not showing the will, and without that, nuclear threats sound hollow to Moscow. That's why more voices inside Britain and NATO are now saying symbolic forces won't work. Only a serious military presence, tens of thousands of troops, can truly deter Russia from striking again. Thank you for watching. For more content, please subscribe.